I think that over the last day and a half, we've gotten a good handle on how devastating the impact of forcibly displaced people is on our world and to those individuals. I think we're all feeling impatient, passionate about this issue, and eager to find what we individually can do to help solve this problem or help reduce some of the pain and conflict. I'm going to start, before taking questions, to ask our panelists either to give you all a concrete recommendation for things that you individually can do, or to at least shine a light on something, a positive policy, an interesting innovation by a nonprofit, an interesting innovation by a host community that we can attempt to talk about and replicate. Again, we're trying to bend the curve down and change the devastating situation the world faces today. So I'm going to start at the far end with our final speaker. Ms. Zafar, you're going to go first.
Thank you so much. I just want to start with actually a question we got from the audience in our panel from Camille Mackler, one of the young lawyers in New York. I mean, this was, in the last 2 weeks, one of the most heartening things for any one of us to say, that the word refugee was considered a derided word only about a month ago. The word Muslim was considered a controversial word, and suddenly in the last 2 weeks, we embrace both of those in a very different way. And the credit for that goes to young people all across the country who rose to this occasion so well. I mean, tell you, the first lawsuit that was filed by law students at about 5:30 in the morning. No middle-aged man was going to get up at 5:30 in the morning to do that. And in the course of a weekend, 1,600 lawyers from all across the country with their laptops volunteered to go to the airports all across the country. If that is not where our country is, I would say, if that's where our country is, I think we have huge hope. Let me just say on our policy stuff, to be more concrete about it, one of the most interesting developments in our country about the kind of themes that I talked about today comes from three very different but distinct sort of constituencies. One is the business sector, the other is the clergy, and the third are law enforcement people. These are three very important forces in our society, and they're beginning to talk about immigration in a way we haven't heard in a long time. That people from faith are saying that this is important for the values and the faith we come from. People from business are saying that this is actually so important for the economic prosperity of our country. And law enforcement people are saying that it's important for law enforcement that we get people out of the shadows into the mainstream. Thank you.
Talk to in your community, and that will help significantly. Alexandra.
This one?
Either one.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to say something from kind of in line with the perspective that I was giving yesterday. And if we're to acknowledge that the majority of the people displaced today are probably not going to cross a border and are certainly not going to make it to Europe or the US, I'd like to recognize that we need to think about local solutions, providing local solutions to these people. And so I'd just like to mention the example coming from a research project that I worked on a few years ago, looking at Congolese and Burundian refugees living in Tanzania. Some of them started their journey into Tanzania as early as the 1970s, coming from Burundi, from several waves of violence in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And they settled in refugee camps in Tanzania. There are two major refugee camps there, Nyarugusu and Kigoma. These refugee camps are quite informal, but they're massive. They're not as massive as Dadaab, but they've been quite big. And these refugees had been living there for decades. The children who were born into these refugee camps had never even known their country of origin. So when the decision was made to start emptying out those camps and sending these people back through a voluntary return process, a lot of these refugees had no desire to return. And so the question of local integration came up. And we interviewed hundreds of Burundian and Congolese refugees in Tanzania who gave us some really positive examples and stories of how they felt that they were far more integrated in their country of refuge, Tanzania. They spoke Tanzanian Swahili. They were Anglophone. They had married, for some locally, with Tanzanians. Their children, the lucky ones, went to school. They had set up local businesses. So why would they ever want to return to a country that they didn't know, to speak a language that they didn't know, and to have their children struggle in an education system that they didn't know? So I think it's important, and I think it was Mustafa, you mentioned the issue of legal status, or maybe it was you, I can't remember, but someone mentioned the importance of legitimizing people in the places where they found refuge when they actually want it and where it's possible. In the case of Tanzania, there may even be a possibility to grant some Burundians, not all of them, but some Burundians Tanzanian citizenship. Why not, when you've been living there for 40 years? So I think local integration is certainly one of the three what we call durable solutions to displacement that is not explored enough, that is not invested in enough. We tend to always want to return these people to where they came from, but I would plead for more local integration. And then I'd just like to also mention something about host communities, having lived in Congo for so long. I don't tap myself on the back for showing empathy here, because I come from a privileged background, and I think it would be inhuman not to show empathy. But I think that people who are not privileged, who are extremely poor, who suffer on a daily basis, for those people to actually show empathy, for host communities to welcome with open arms IDPs and refugees, I think it's absolutely amazing. And I've witnessed throughout Eastern Congo, from North Kivu to South Kivu, so many families literally living in huts. The door is wide open. They host, they feed dozens of children coming from their friends, their relatives, and they don't raise an eyebrow. They do it without thinking, without questioning, without complaining. So I think we can also all learn from those experiences.
Jim?
Well, to echo a little bit of what I said earlier, I think one of the great things that we can do in this country is to recognize that we have an all-volunteer military. And it's just amazing to me to think, with 1.3 million people on active duty, that all of them are volunteers. And for the last 10 years, despite what the warnings were back in the late 60s, that all volunteer force works until it meets contact with reality. If there's a war, young men and women won't be volunteering. And they have. And so they're coming from some of our wealthiest communities. In fact, there are 3 enlistees from the wealthiest American neighborhoods for 2 that come from the poorest neighborhoods. This is a group that gets maligned as being less educated. The average enlistee reads at a grade level higher than your average civilian. So wonderful men and women who are joining, I think, encouraging them and thanking them for their service. And the fact is, when we think about how to fight against the root causes, we think of our troops being sent to places that are failed states or war-torn, and that certainly happens. But the bulk of deployments are to allied countries. And one of the places where we've had a long-term alliance that most Americans don't even know, we've had troops based in Turkey for over 5 decades. That's an ally of ours. It's one of the bright spots in the Middle East and has been. Doesn't mean everything's perfect in Turkey. But I think encouraging young people and recognizing the service that they're doing is something we can never do enough.
So I had the privilege 2 days ago to spend the day with Catholic Charities Maine and have some time with refugees that have been resettled in a nearby community. And I have to say, you can never replace having direct contact with people. And so I think, in preparation for the Camden Conference, I was looking actually online because I knew I would be asked this question: what can we do either in Camden or in the state or more broadly? And I don't know if they timed it exactly with this conference, but the New York Times 2 days ago had a really great piece by Ron Lieber that basically spells out whether or not you want to engage internationally. There are obviously great organizations that you can support with your pocketbook. There are also great organizations that you can support domestically, and whether or not it's the UN or Interaction that has a broad network of non-governmental organizations. Catholic Charities is about to take on the role now of the resettlement affiliate. It's something called, it was a new term for me, replacement designee. And that means that those refugees that are coming to this state will have a network of supporters who will help them integrate. And there will be so many ways that citizens like yourselves can reach out and make those refugees feel connected. And I know Catholic Charities, I'm sure, would appreciate the help. But whether or not it's volunteering, or it's hosting a family and reaching out for a dinner, a conversation, trying to get to know each other a little bit more deeply, of course, embracing diversity, and advocating, whether or not that's internationally or that's locally. All is going to be very important, but I can't recommend enough this piece that just came out, which really gives some very good examples of ways that you can continue the good spirit that's generated here in Camden. Thank you.
We're in the midst of an information war. Many people who are not here in this opera house or the other venues that are following the Camden Conference do not necessarily share the empathy that is in this room and the other rooms, and they would not necessarily believe many of the facts that we are trying to share with you. So I do think that there's an opportunity for all of you. There is a small town in Macedonia called Velish. Velish has become the capital of the trolls that are basically Russian orchestrated to basically disseminate fake news. And they are the trolls who basically try to affect Human Rights Watch, everything we try to put out as basically fake, as basically unverified, as basically just falsehood. And those trolls are going to hit institutions like UNHCR, they're going to hit European Stability Initiative, they're going to start hitting anyone who tries to obviously bring facts to counter the narratives that are out there, the narratives of division and hate. So what I think you could start to do is to start turning Camden and Portland and Bristol and Rockport and so many other places into Belfast into the counter-Velish. The more you, through your social media platforms, can follow a Gerald or a Mustafar or a Kelly or myself, the institutions and the organizations we work for in helping us disseminate our information, the better. And secondly, what you have here is very unique, very unique. And I do think that you should take the Camden Conference on a roadshow. Have Camden out west, Camden in the Midwest, because this conference has a very unique DNA. And I do think that that would be a great tribute and heritage for an idea that started 30 years ago. And that way we can have the Honorable Lady attend the very first Camden Conference somewhere outside of Maine to change mentalities outside of Maine.
I second what Bruno just said about the Camden Conference. I can't say how wonderful this last day and a half have been. On the recommendations, perhaps I would say three specific issues. What both Kelly and Alex have talked about in terms of host communities. I mean, local governments are at the forefront of dealing with refugee influx. I'm using Lebanon as an example, where with political paralysis at the level of government, it's really been the municipalities that have worked hard to integrate and to provide services for better or worse often, but they've been at the forefront of having to deal with refugees. And I think the local governments in the US are at the forefront of trying to push for better legislation, but also to work with local communities to better integrate refugees that have come into this community. And Camden is a phenomenal example of that, so keep doing this. Perhaps a second area is the issue of innovation. I'll give two very quick examples, and this goes back to the point Kelly was making on, Alex was making on the issue of local communities, investing in local solutions. Technology, there's been tremendous innovation in issues surrounding refugees. Two very specific examples. Two young Jordanians have been using 3D printers in order to print prosthetic limbs that are designed by children who have lost their limbs. And it's a way of helping these children be more accepting of this foreign body that is being added to them. It's been phenomenally successful. They're working in different refugee camps. This is a way to sort of use technology to invest in particular issues related to traumatized communities, refugee communities in the region. So helping with this or replicating these kinds of initiatives is one way. Another initiative that I know of is a coalition of aid providers that were actually helping around the island of Lesbos. And I think they were called Aid Startup. They created a platform where they were trying to provide aid to those in need in a much more cost-efficient and much speedier manner than, unfortunately, UN agencies were able to. And there was a lot of innovation in the way you track packages, you do things. These are all very practical issues. But I think the way you harness technology in order to support those most in need, I think, is very important. And I think this is where a lot of the young talent here can also, you can look at these examples, look at other examples, and maybe think of new examples that can come out of Camden. The third particular issue, I would say some NGOs, and I'll use one example, which is an NGO called Ana Akra that I'm involved with. This is an NGO that provides education. It started 20 years ago. It started with wanting to expose children to reading. It works with public schools to build up libraries in public schools and expose children to reading. What they are doing today is and this is the picture I showed of the young refugee children was from that school. They provide informal education to Syrian children who are unable to attend school. They take this education to the places where they are, to the communities where they're in, and provide this kind of education. Syrian teachers are not allowed to teach in Lebanon, so they're working with them informally to also use these teachers to provide education to these children, and at least give them some potential hope in their lives at a time when there is none at this point. So I'll stop right there.
Well, this has been an extremely inspiring and energizing 2 days. And I think one reason it's been so inspiring is because of the way issues have been debated here, with passion, with empathy, but also with facts. Now, one of the key lessons any skeptical European always brings to America is that this shouldn't be taken for granted. Take it from me, history has no direction. When my mother was born in 1944 in Berlin, which was burning and at war and the capital of one of the most evil empires the world ever saw, it wasn't clear that her grandchildren would live in a city where 1/3 of the population are immigrants and children of immigrants, in a country that last year, Germany, took in 2.1 million foreigners, and I'm sorry, Tim, that is twice the number the US took in.
Keep going.
Took in 1 million.
And I think, no, but in 1 year. That was 2015. And I think this was only possible because in 1945 there were some wise Americans who believed that anything was possible. But remember, in 1914, Europe was more prosperous. People lived longer lives, had more technology. Germany had more universities, more scientists, more philosophers than ever before in history. And we know what happened in the 30 years after 1914. So as somebody who lives in Berlin, who walks around the city, which is full of monuments to the inhumanity that human beings, the city, the people of Germany have done to other human beings, remind us everywhere of the Stasi and the Nazis and everything bad that people could think of. The one thing that we should have no tolerance for is when people take people's justified fears and fan them with lies. Because I tell you, this is extremely dangerous. I've seen it in the Balkans. I was a tour guide in former Yugoslavia. As a tourist guide in 1990, I went to Mostar, I went to Sarajevo, I went to Banja Luka. I saw a mosque which was blown up 3 years later. Because politicians fanned lies about threats which didn't exist, about terrorism which didn't exist, about genocide which didn't exist, and then these things did happen. History has no direction. One thing we've learned is that it's important to be tolerant. But one thing we shouldn't be tolerant of is politicians who invent reasons to fear that is not based in facts, for cynical reasons, to stay in power. And if I tell you that there was no terrorist attack in Sweden yesterday, I think you know what I mean. Thank you.
Yes, now I know what it was best to be first rather than nearly the last, you know, with echo what everyone else said, almost everyone else. But let me just go back to a couple of facts and a couple of things from the summit that I didn't emphasize, and then maybe something about me. Just to remind you of where the need is greatest, especially because of this 50% humanitarian financing, is that 86% of all the refugees in the world are in the developing world, the developing countries. And that 5 of the 10 top hosting countries of refugees are in Africa. So when you're looking out for places to help, if not locally, which is a good place to start, but if you're looking to give to charities or big organizations that help around the world, maybe look at those couple of places that are really neglected and not thought of all the time. I wanted to say a couple more things about the integration and inclusion that the summit talked about and that many of you and others have talked about, and saying that if you want to help individual refugees who come into your community or wherever, we talk about how they need to be learning the language, they learn to have health care, they need to have jobs. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard a refugee say, the first day I went to work, I was no longer a refugee. And it just makes you really happy and makes happy for them, and to think that many others could have that same advantage and so on. On children, I regretted that we weren't able to say children never in detention. I regret we weren't able to say children should be in school after a few days, but we did get into the resolutions, the agreements, the commitments, that children should be in school after a few months. Again, an extremely important thing to have the family, the refugee integrated at even briefly wherever they are. Finally, and something I should have mentioned because it's one of the most surprising things that came from the summit, is that the declaration that refugees should be protected regardless of their status. And that's quite a far-reaching thing here in our country and in many other places, but it's a pretty important statement that was made and agreed to by all those governments. Last thing, I just have to say that I mentioned that I've been away from this country for more than 40 years. I'm still traveling too much to really integrate, but I think this week, these few days have been so inspiring for me and so emotional in a way. And I've invited all my foreign friends to say the next time, and they come regularly to visit, we're going to the Northeast, we're going to Maine, so we're coming here.
I'm a profound optimist. I think that there's remarkable people in the world, and the United States is one of those remarkable countries that's made a major difference. But I think the self-delusion that has started to enter the discussion this afternoon is profound and dangerous. And I'm going to take you through some statistics because I think there's an information war that's also internal. I come from Australia, which has the shame of an offshore resettlement program which is putting people into internment camps. But it also settles 4 times the number of refugees as the United States. Let me say that again. It settles, makes citizens, gives jobs, and gives all the human needs they need of health and welfare and activities, and welcomes them into the country 4 times as many. And what you've heard about American exceptionalism is so appallingly parochial, I cannot believe it. Let me go through some figures. I'll just give you one figure. Now, the first figure is, it is completely wrong to say that the United States has taken in an average of 100,000 refugees per year. The last time America took in 100,000 refugees was before 9/11. We know how long ago that was. After 9/11, refugee intake went down to around 25 to 35,000 and only started to increase across the period of the last few years, and it got up to 86,000, which was the highest it's got to. It is a lie to say that we have an average intake of 100,000 refugees. But when you even put it as 100,000, and 84,000 in 2016 is the number, the actual number. Statistics can be stretched in 1,000 different directions, but that's a fact, 86,000. And then you take the most pessimistic, most lowest sense of what number of refugees there are in the world, and I'll take 20 million, although people say there are many more, and if we take internally displaced people, we're talking about something like 86 million. If we take 20 million as our figure for refugees, do you know what percentage per population you are taking of those 20 million refugees? 0.0002. Of those people who are in need, the United States is taking 0.0002 of the world's refugees at the moment. Now, by population, it is 0.004 per person, 0.004. Whereas Jordan is taking, and it's a poor country, Jordan is taking 5% of its population. Turkey is taking 2% of its population. Now, if we think that we're being generous in this country, or even in Australia, which takes 4 times the number of refugees per population as the United States, then we have lost the plot. We need to have pragmatic utopianism which sets up structures and works carefully through these things, rather than just turns to American exceptionalism, as somehow we've had a difficult time for 2 days. It's been complicated, lots of figures have thrown back and forth, but we're okay because we're good people. I would like to coin the next term, is called the nice American and the nice Australian. There are so many nice Australians, it's unbelievable. We are very nice people, and nice Australians are doing really bad things. And I take you to the point that Bruno made about the information war. The information war is with us as well. It's not just out there. And when we come to the stuff that Maha or Karen was talking about, or what Gerald was reinforcing, those issues mean that we live in dangerous times. And to be dangerous times, we need a different kind of optimism. It needs to be pragmatic optimism. It needs to be careful optimism, and not self-serving, parochial optimism. Thank you.
I think I can speak for everybody in this room that we both want that pragmatic optimism, because we honestly do want to make a difference, and we are impatient to make that difference. So I'd like to open it up to the audience here. We've got runners. We have folks in the remote sites. Please do get your questionnaires down to people, and I've got one up here.
Hey there, my name is Kelly O'Connor. My question is for Mr. Kane. Do the statistics you provided on the reduction of violent deaths globally include those civilian deaths that have occurred as a direct result of the destabilizing conditions that conflict and war create, where it can be concluded that these deaths would otherwise not occur without these destabilizing conditions? And if they do not include those indirect conditions-related deaths, do you think that perhaps the figures provided might be misleading by not capturing the total and more comprehensive physical human cost of war and conflict?
Good question. Yeah, I may have said a few lies up here, but they weren't mine. I was citing US government data before on the number of refugees we bring in. So if the President Obama had lied to us about hundreds of thousands that have been brought in, I accept that as true. And I like this kind of disagreement, though, about who can be more generous. I think that's the right goal. So, Paul, I hope you and I agree that we want our countries to be more generous, to welcome more immigrants, more refugees. I've tried to shift my emphasis on, let's go to the root causes. How have we reduced war deaths? So you asked specifically about data, and I'm not an expert on that data. It's the best data I've seen. I've cited it in my papers before, but to dig into the methodology, it's an important area of research. I think you make a really good point, though. It probably doesn't count, medical deaths, right? Or people that die because they don't have electricity in all of their villages yet. And so that, to me, is the imperative, that I'm impatient to spread economic development. And I've studied most of all how that works and how it doesn't work. And it's not all about the United States. I think we've played a really special role. But, it was our alliance with France, say, that helped us when we stood up as a country. So there are universal values, Enlightenment values. I think we're on the right side of that history. And I want to push human development, not just growth, all of human development, medical development, electrification of communities. And the UN has been incredibly important in that. So you're right, it gets a lot more complicated than just battle deaths, because then it gets conflicted. But we live in a better world. Let's focus on where the long-term solutions will be. And I think those focus on economic development fundamentally. And to if I can broaden my remarks just a little, to provide a counter model to some of these evil states that exist. And I think Syria might be case number one. I'm not sure Syria can be solved by sending in the Marines. I think it can be solved in the long term by helping Jordan and Turkey prosper. Jordan and Turkey are two of our longest standing allies, and the fact that Paul pointed out how many refugees they're taking in, I think is applicable to our shared values.
Paul, you want?
Tim and I agree on many things, but statistics is not one of them. I've edited and written 4 books, 6 books, depending on how you count them. On the question of globalization and violence. Death in war is not the same as violence. And what's happened in those statistics, and what we've seen across the course of the 20th century, is a shift in the nature of war. War has a very particular definition of it, and that definition means that Tim's figures are exactly right for interstate war. However, war has actually shifted to what's now called transnational localized violence, and that includes what's happening in Syria. That's not a war yet. There's no war happening in Syria. Take that in, and then you'll remember that the statistics about what happens through violent mechanisms, which includes displaced persons, but it also includes actual people who die because of malnutrition, lack of water, disease, injury because they don't have hospitalization, is massive. Those figures are not going down at all, and it depends upon how you do your statistics.
Peter Imber, Camden. Question for Gerald. I'm going to test your optimism. Elections coming up in Europe. What are your thoughts?
Open-ended question.
Well, we have 3 big elections coming up this year, one in a few weeks, one in a few months, and then one in September. The Netherlands, France, and Germany. I think in the Netherlands there'll be a strong showing for a real extremist party with an incredibly dangerous agenda, Geert Wilders. But because of the system of proportional representation, if he gets 25%, even if he comes first, which I really hope he will not, he wouldn't form part of the government. And then actually it depends on the others, the Democrats, to not govern in his spirit, but create an alternative coalition. France, I was very worried. I lived in France the last 5 years, and I saw the makeover of the Front National. It used to be much easier to understand what they stood for when you had this former torturer from the Algerian War as its president. Now it's his charming daughter. And she's really been very successful, and she is extremely smart, and I would even say charming on television. But I've watched some of their party congresses in recent years, and it's very telling when the crowd at the party congress claps and when they just listen politely. So there are a lot of things which are being said for the wider public to make over, to present this as a mainstream party, and then you realize where people clap. I think this Marine Le Pen as president of France would be extremely dangerous for France, for Europe, and in the end also for the US, because it could undo the whole story of European integration. But I had the fortune a few weeks ago to meet another candidate who at that time was third in the polls. Now he's second in the polls, and if he comes to a runoff, everybody says he will win. Emmanuel Macron. He came to Berlin to give a speech in English. There were all these French cameras, and he said, as a French politician, I'm supposed to speak in French, but I want to be understood. And 700 people at Humboldt University in Berlin thought, wow. And then he said, at the end of his speech, he quoted a French Jewish philosopher who said the key of everything is trust, and he ended his speech by saying, I trust in Germany, which also was the kind of message that in Europe today the major European powers need to make about each other. He praised Merkel's refugee policy. He talked about French colonialism as a crime against humanity. He waved the European flag. He talked about the need for French reform. He really shouldn't win a French election. Look, he worked for an investment bank. He went to elite schools, but he is very charismatic. He married his teacher, who is 20 years older than he is, which is the opposite of Sarkozy, who marries women 20 years younger. And the French appreciate this. So if we get Emmanuel Macron winning in France in May, and really honestly, I'm not worried about Germany. Germany, it's really unusual nowadays that you have, of the many parties who have a chance of entering the Bundestag, I'm hard-pressed to know who I would vote for, because I really appreciate Angela Merkel. I think I would vote for her this time. But the Green Party is very good. The Social Democrats have a convinced European. The Liberals are good. There is a far-right party. I hope it will be below 10%. It would be the first time a far-right party enters the German Bundestag. That would be bad. But the mainstream is solid. So I think with a solid German government, with a solid president in France, Europe at the end of this year might at least not add to our headaches.
Great, thank you. And I know I have some questions here. We have a question from one of our remote sites, so I want to go there first. What would a just, effective, and compassionate U.S. immigration policy look like? I'm going to send that all the way down to Ms.
Well, that's a long invitation. I think we have been debating the right response to immigration for a long time, at least for the last 15 years. And it is clearly a combination of things. It just is not one bullet is not going to solve all problems, pardon the use of that term here. First, you have to deal with people. It is about people. And it is hugely about the 11.2 million people who are living in our shadows. That's the big elephant in the room. And you have to have both a fair and a workable solution to that. I would say that we can disagree on how quickly these people should become citizens, but they ultimately should become citizens. It's not in the interest of our society to have any group of people who has different and subservient rights than the rest of the population. We don't have to start with citizenship. We can just make them legal. We can then soon make them permanent residents. And then, like everyone else, they would be eligible to become citizens. I'm not sure we need a direct pathway to citizenship, which a lot of people argue for. But we need a pathway for them to become permanent residents. Second is that we do need a more effective enforcement regime. As I said in my talk, we have done almost everything we can do at the border. We have provided incentives for people not to come in crossing the border. We have made it very hard for them to come in, because if we pick them up now, we take them to another part of the country so that we disrupt the smuggling networks. So we call this the consequence enforcement system, and it's working. And we have put more resources in this effort. I think where we probably will do better is focusing our resources in the workplace, which is make it more easy for employers to be able to hire only those people who are authorized to work. But that cannot work if there are people who we need to work but who are not authorized to work. We always building a self-perpetuating system of failure. Therefore, a combination of a workplace, better workplace enforcement has to come with new legal ways for people to come. And I would say, in departure from the past, we don't need to bring everyone in the country to work and live here forever. The world has hugely changed from a time when, people would come and burn their boats and the rest of the country and say, we just want to live. We might be able to have a system where people say, look, we want to come for a certain number of years, but be able to work legally. And then maybe in a cycle of migration, be able to go back to their countries and come a few years later to work again. That's a departure from the US system, but we should try something different so that we have a legal option for people to come as against the illegal options, which is what we now have.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the question back here, number one. Here.
Hi, I'm Arnie McDonald. I'm from Freeport, Maine, and among other things, I'm a volunteer attorney for the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Panel, volunteer lawyers doing asylum work. And I wanted to just briefly maybe answer a question, which was why do so many people want to come to Maine in the camps? And one reason is the work of ILAP, which has a 99% success rate on asylum applications compared to like 20% for across the board. Another reason for that is that Maine's got a very progressive general assistance availability for refugees, which ILAP and the Maine Equal Justice Partners passed. Those are under attack right now by the governor, who is very much opposed to that and was anti-immigrant. And those of you who would like to get involved locally in asylum and pro-refugee issues should pay attention with Maine Equal Justice Partners and ILAP to what the governor is doing there. To put a little bit of a commercial pitch up, ILAP's big fundraiser is next month on, I think, the 24th. Anybody who wants to get involved in the refugee community in Maine should pay attention to that. It's a great place to go and find out what's going on. I was actually going to give a shout. The third reason I think that Maine is so successful in being a desired place for refugees is Catholic Charities. And it's, I think every refugee family that comes through Maine touches Catholic Charities, and anybody who wants to get involved should inquire with Catholic Charities.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to the next question then, up here.
Thank you. My name is Stefano De Campo, and I'm a professor at the University of Maine. And I just wanted to get a reflection from some of the panel members. A lot of the conversations we've had this week, these last 2 days, seem to be very paternalistic in the sense that it is from the top-bottom approach. But I wanted to see if there is, from your other solution box instruments, a bottom-up approach where the solution comes from inside those countries and not necessarily from you, because to me it's sad when Paul competes with Tim about who is the best, and if we had a Canadian here, we would have another one saying, oh, we are the best at bringing people to our country. And I wonder if it is institutional within the advocated agency, the United Nations, which for the long time does really not have a good record because this crisis continues to unfold. So, for example, a crisis will unfold in Venezuela. It is clear. And yet the instruments of the criminal organizations already have solutions inside Venezuela to figure out how to make money out of the crisis that is coming. And yet here, the United Nations is not signaling or the rich countries of the world are not signaling Venezuela as a case. It will only be signaled after you have a crisis, and that's always the case. You only have a crisis, but you could offer solutions to that crisis way before things happen. The criminal organizations seem to be more effective.
Great. I think that question about local solutions is a really good one. Kelly, I know you all support local solutions. Why don't you give us a couple of examples that really go to that point?
Well, I was going to go global first and just say somebody yesterday, I'm sorry, I can't remember which panelist, talked about the new Secretary General and his priorities. Bruno happens to be my old boss. He has put a real focus both on the prevention side in terms of conflict and looking at root cause issues from its very core. And it's not from just where he sits in New York, but it goes right down to the country, local, community level. For us, we could not do what we do without local organizations and obviously refugees and displaced being actively involved in the programs in which we're trying to deliver. Designing programs, we take our cues from them, we change them as a result of what they tell us. And in terms of the solutions, whether or not that is, for example, I mentioned not having parallel structures where you have Ugandan kids being educated right next to Burundian kids, for example, where there is a real community approach in terms of making sure that families are able to provide for themselves just from the very beginning of a crisis. These are not solutions in the long systemic sense in terms of a peace settlement resolution, which of course we would like nothing better so those Burundian kids can go home too. However, this means that a family can have some sense of normalcy, that kids are being educated for the future, whether or not they're going to be spending it in Uganda or going back to Burundi and rebuilding their country. But these are the sorts of things that are so important in terms of the types of design. And it goes, if we gave you the impression that it's global top-down, it's nothing but. Thanks.
I'm going to take a few more questions.
There was a criticism, that's all.
Oh, yeah, feel free.
I'm just taking issue with your point you made. We were arguing over who was most generous. We weren't arguing over who was most generous. I was suggesting none of us are generous. I think one of the things that's happening is that local people have wonderfully generous spirits, and there are many things that local people can do. But our nation states are not acting generously at the moment. That includes all of them. There are 3 large countries in the world. The 3 largest population countries are China and India and the United States. And of those, the United States is acting the best, but that's not generous.
Let's go to this question here.
Chair. Hi, I'm Phyllis Coelho from Belfast, and this is a question for Mr. Chisty. What are your thoughts on the recent deportation of within the past 3 weeks or less, over 600 undocumented people who are mostly from Mexico, other countries in Central America, as a result of Trump's executive order. Some of these people have been living in the United States for 20 years, and now they've been separated from their families. It's been a horrendous situation. The media has given it just not too much coverage because of, Trump's tweets and the whole thing with Russia and everything else. But I'm very concerned about these people and their families.
As we all should be. Listen, these are the facts. We have 11.2 million unauthorized people in the United States. With all the resources that we have given in terms of money, in terms of manpower, in terms of technology, we simply do not have resources to deport all 11.2 million people. That's a fact. So what smart people do, what all smart law enforcement people do, is that they establish priorities. We do not have resources to deport a gang member and deport an ordinary landscaper who's just trying to make a living. So you have to draw priorities. It took 8 years, 6, and then it sort of perfected towards the end, for the Obama administration to establish priorities about whom we're going to remove. And they were finally getting it quite right. In the last 2 years of the Obama administration, about 90% of people who were removed from the country, people who either had criminal convictions for serious crimes or were recent arrivals who had not established roots. And time as it took, it was the right policy to adopt. This administration, we don't know what ultimately it will do, seems to have been in a hurry to do something different from what the last administration did, just to establish that new sheriff was in town. And in that manner, what they did is they said all old priorities are gone. And we're going to have new priorities. And guess what the new priorities are? There are no priorities. When there are no priorities, you have random enforcement of immigration, which is sort of what's been happening in the last 2 years. It's obviously very disruptive of these families. These are people who have as I said, they have US citizen kids. Now this mother has to make a choice. Is she leaving her US citizen kids here in care of someone she may not know, or is she going to take them back to Mexico, where they have no contact with anything? So this is obviously immigration enforcement growing wild. And as long as we have to establish priorities, the step priorities should be based on removing people who are a threat to our national security, who are a threat to our safety, and should not be focused on people who have deep roots in our community and are actually contributing members of our society. And we all should be opposed to that kind of enforcement.
Let's go down here.
Hi, my name is Charles. I'm here from Camden. This question is to Ms. Abdezaid and maybe Bruno or anybody else. I commend you for the 2016 summit on migration, and I do understand that there is no, as was talked about yesterday, there's no enforcement mechanism for it. Is there, though, any plan to just shed some light in the future, just show some statistics as to how different countries, of the 193 that signed on it, how they are performing in achieving the objectives that they signed to?
Well, as I mentioned, there are follow-ups to the 2 global compacts, so there will be definitely meetings starting now and going through up until 2018 to follow up whether it says in the compacts should be carried out, whether the refugee situation is improved, whether the migrant situation is improved, and so on. So I think they will be following, but what you're suggesting is something very specific, and I think something, I'll be sure they get back to the teams that have taken over this to see that they're doing that. So thank you for that suggestion. I want to just acknowledge, I keep writing down in my notes that I should mention Canada. Some people have mentioned Canada, but it is a country that is extraordinary in what it's doing for refugees and taking them in, and migrants. It's a country of family sponsorship, and they have many, many, many more families who are asking to sponsor refugees than they have refugees who are there to be sponsored. And they've taken in 2,500 people in a couple of weeks and taken them to little villages in the same place, and all of those economies improved in those places. I mean, Canada is an example for the rest of the world.
Thought number 3.
Hi, my name is Ruben. I'm a student at the University of Maine from Santa Cruz, California. John F. Kennedy once wrote in A Nation of Immigrants that immigration policy should be generous, fair, and flexible, and with such policy we can turn to the world and to our past with clean hands and clear conscience. My question is, why do you think we will or won't achieve this idea in the near future?
Tim, can I give you that question?
Sure. I want to repeat this statistic that was brought up earlier. I think Karen said 86% of refugees are coming from developing countries, poor countries, right? That's right. They're in, sorry. So the long-term solution to meet Kennedy's goal is to reduce the number of developing countries, help them actually develop, become wealthier. And free trade's a big part of that. I think those are your long-term solutions, that there's no amount of generosity that can solve the problem. It's got to be not paternalism either, but it's got to be doing what we can to be open to help. And I think in particular, I like to point to something the UN did. The UN, moving beyond just this notion of paternalism, started to measure the economies of the world in what's called a Doing Business Index, and really shines a spotlight on countries that make it very, very difficult to start a new business, to hire a worker, to fire a worker. It's things like that that have made these countries realize they don't want to be backwards, and embarrass some of them that they have such an anti-business, anti-development agenda that essentially feeds a system of corruption. So I think that's how we keep emphasizing economic freedom and have faith that what's led to so much prosperity in the last 50 years, that we not lose faith in that here at home.
I'll let Gerald add a little bit to that, then go to a remote question.
Yes, on the Doing Business Index, because we've worked on this a bit. This is a World Bank flagship
Oh,
project.
sorry, World Bank, yeah.
Yes, but I wouldn't trust it too much. It showed in the last years that Macedonia had a better business climate than Germany, and Georgia had a better business climate than Switzerland, because the way it is measured, it's very easy to manipulate, and so some of these countries, the Macedonian Prime Minister and the Georgian government, put a few people in charge of making sure that there would be this one office in the capital where you could get a business license in 2 days. So we've written about this, you can Google it, ESI, doing business. So I agree, we should have these countries become wealthier. The doing business indicator is not a sign of success, I fear.
Macedonia is good business for the trolls. Velis is in Macedonia.
Okay, let's go to the remote question.
Macedonia is full of trolls.
The U.S. could take more than 100,000 or 150,000 immigrants. What keeps the numbers so low?
Well, the numbers actually are not that low. I mean, to be complete fair, as I try to point out, we take 1 million people a year as green card holders. And it's just as that it may be that we have distributed that in a way that is creating discordance in the labor market. That we now have our legal system in which there is no avenue for especially low-skilled workers, low-wage workers to enter the United States. Our present quota system allows 5,000 people to come for low-wage jobs. That's just appalling. So we obviously need to revisit the system through which we select people. What I was trying to say that it doesn't, in revisiting that system in the 21st century, we no longer have to be wedded to the model of 1952. Mm-hmm. Is that we may look at a system in which they all don't have to come here with green cards. We may be allowed to, at least some of them, have the option of coming to work for short periods of time, as long as we guarantee that they give labor rights and human rights as the workers, rest of the country have. So in that regard, that's the reform of the system that we need.
Great. Maha, you wanted to add something?
Just one word. I think that there is a slippage between immigration and refugees.
Yeah.
And it's not the same thing. And this was, I think, one of the problems with Tim's numbers, perhaps, is that the percentage of refugees amongst the total number of immigrants coming into this country, it's two different things. And
So what are the right numbers?
Well, that number is about immigrants.
So there were 1 million immigrants a year that we have right now, and the refugees that are brought into the U.S.
But
Last year it was 85,000.
that includes, that
that was
1 million includes that.
Pardon me?
The 1 million includes that.
Right. So we had the head of the office leader for the Office of Immigration Statistics, Mark Rosenblum, who I think, Mark, was with your organization.
My colleague, yeah.
Yeah, before he joined the government. He said the number is more to be around 150,000. It depends on how you're counting them. So maybe Mark's a liar too, but I took him at his word that the number's over 100,000.
You're talking about refugees?
Refugees.
Yeah. They could be, because we authorize 100, but it takes long time for people, because we do this extreme vetting.
I'm just
it takes long time for people to come
I'm just
in.
cautioning about the slippage between immigration and refugees. That's it. We need to distinguish between those two categories.
Yes, we will distinguish between those two, and let's go to the source of these statistics. Kelly, I'm going to you, actually.
There you are, Kelly.
This is about the U.S. resettlement program, of which we are not the source. However, when we're talking about refugee resettlement to this country, and I go back to the remarks earlier, last year it was 85,000, which was a high water from previous years. These are refugees that come through referrals from my agency. There are other ways that people can come to this country, including visa programs, for example, humanitarian parole, and so on. So it is very important, as Maha mentions, to be very clear about what we're talking about in terms of people coming to the country and the types of protections they need.
So there's a distinction between refugees and asylees, right?
Yes.
And there's a 2-year vetting program. I think this is also important to emphasize. They don't just come in overnight. There's a very rigorous 2-year vetting program for refugees to come into this country.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go out here to number 2.
Oops, sorry. Louisa Boatwright from Newport, Rhode Island. I want to get back to sort of the policy problem, and as I see it, and you've said several times that the immigration laws from the 1950s, I believe our Congress is broken and we need to have some answers. Our far right has made the Republican caucus not work. There's no compromises. From Maine, Olympia Snow has written a great book. We have people who are leaving the Republican Party because it's too extreme. And I think that the whole thing, many have said, is gerrymandering has caused this. Is there anything you all can tell us that may allow us to address that issue of the extreme left and the extreme right and the broken Congress so we can get some policy changes out of our government?
Bruno, I'm going to go to you on this because you are a director of policy, and how do you most effectively influence policymakers?
I am no expert on gerrymandering.
You will quickly become one.
Just speaking of one. Policy, how do you influence policy? What are some of the best strategies we can offer for influencing policy?
Well, look, basically, our methodology, at least, is based on the model of naming and shaming. That's what you have to do. You have to name and shame those that are just not responding to the evidence that is out there and is unquestionable. And I think that today you have heard very compelling presentation as to why the immigration system in this country is broken and how there are some common sense middle ground solutions that could basically respond to most of the concerns that are out there. And so that's why you need to name and shame the people in Congress who are not responding to what makes sense, what would be humane, and what would respond and be in line with the values and principles that the city in the Shining Hill has presumably been trying to hold on through already its more than 2 centuries of independence.
We're getting down to our last few questions, but we'll start up here, and we've got some on.
Meg Toohey from Salem, Massachusetts, and our boat lives in Rockport. I wanted to come back to something several of you have raised. You've spoken about the information war and the efforts to influence elections in Europe and also in Australia. Is Russia really the only actor? Can you tell us more about this? Thank you.
Joe, do you want to?
He's rubbing his head.
Well, I used to say when people asked me about Russian influence in the Balkans, for example, in recent years, that Russia is weak, but if we, the democracies, are weaker, Russia has influence. And what we've seen in recent years is that, and perhaps I should make this more personal, I was actually a Carnegie Fellow in Moscow at the beginning of the refugee crisis. And I remember we wrote some of our reports that we sent to the German and other governments, sitting in a cafe off the Red Square. And I realized, talking to Russian experts, people, people around the Kremlin, that I should stop talking about the refugee crisis because their eyes were glowing. Because they saw this, indeed, as Cass pointed out, as a golden opportunity to weaken the very politicians they dislike the most in Europe, for example. I mean, they don't like Angela Merkel because she had a principled policy that, in fact, hurt German business interests to put together sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. They don't like that. They were surprised by that. They thought every politician can be bought. I mean, they do employ a former German chancellor working for Gazprom. So they were surprised that this daughter of a Protestant minister who went to East Germany from the West when it was communist in order to practice, that's why Angela Merkel lived in East Germany, her parents moved there voluntarily, that she was principled. So they thought the refugee crisis is a great opportunity. But they are only as strong, these outside autocrats, as we are weak. I mean, they need allies in our societies. And one of the worst things, I agree fully, why should the US take Syrians? Others can do that. Europeans can do that, honestly. But what is unacceptable, I think, and extremely damaging to everyone, is when US politicians, like currently, not only do not take Syrians, but make the work of those politicians in Europe or in Canada or elsewhere who do want to take refugees from the biggest human rights refugee catastrophe in the world today, who do want to take them, make their work more difficult by echoing the kind of rhetoric we hear from the Kremlin. If a certain person in the White House would just shut up.
Paul, I think you have something to add to that.
I wanted to reinforce that very simple point. The Russians are not the problem. The Russians are doing things which are only made possible by our own civil societies and the complexities of the situation we face with not just an information war, but an information overload. And so it's conferences like this which are fundamental and crucial. They should be being replicated across the country so people can get together to debate the world's and the nation's biggest issues. And as they do so, there'll be people who are far more informed, who come to have an understanding of the complexity of the world. There are no single word answers, there are no single sentence answers to the complexity we face. And I think what this conference has raised are the very things which counter the war that we're seeing coming globally.
Okay, thank you. Over here.
Good morning, Rafael Grossman from Venezuela and from Maine. I'm a surgeon, but I'm also one of my interests is in the harnessing technology to improve healthcare, access to healthcare and education. And this is a practical question. What's the current status, I guess in general, of the access to technology, let's say in refugee camps? The status of having smartphones or computers or just internet, good internet that allowed those people there to access resources, to access banking, to access maybe banks of families who might want to take them, or education, or doing teleconsulting, telementoring, telemedicine. What's the status of those camps? Do they have internet at all?
Can I ask Alexandra to start with the IDP populations, what you're seeing in the IDP populations, and Kelly, maybe you can jump in on the refugee camps.
I think the answer to that question is going to be that it varies hugely from place to place and from context to context. Of course, mobile phone technology has really impregnated most of the world, even in sub-Saharan Africa. I remember every person I would meet in Congo had always 2 mobile phones on the table next to them, ready to pounce. But I'm not talking about people in extremely rural areas who, of course, don't even have electricity, so they certainly wouldn't have a mobile phone. So I think mobile phone technology has come quite a long way and I think is still, unless someone has a better answer, is still the #1 provider of information. And I think that that's also what has probably increased the possibility, for mobility, because of course you get access to information that you didn't have before, and that still remains, as we've said, information is key. In terms of using technology for actually providing services, I know that a number of international NGOs and international agencies have started piloting a lot of promising projects and new approaches whereby you can actually even transfer, money and services through. Maybe Kelly, you'll be better at answering that than I am. So in terms of the response, I think it's also very much improved the response. Maybe to just say a word about, I was talking about it last night with my wonderful host. To say something about our work is that we've actually started piloting new technologies to actually track people on the move and detect displacement across the world. We've been doing it up until now in a relatively traditional way, i.e. Relying on the data that comes from our partners like UNHCR, IOM, OCHA, and other humanitarian and actors on the ground and national governments. It's a very time-consuming process. And now we're beginning to pilot other ways like the use of anonymized mobile phone call data records, where you can actually track SIM cards on the move, literally. That was used during the Haiti earthquake to actually see where people were going, from one place to another, especially when they're moving en masse after a major disaster like an earthquake. We've also started partnering with UNOSAT to use satellite imagery. That's of particular relevance when you're trying to track people who are going to be displaced by very obvious events like the construction of a dam, for example. So there is satellite imagery available for that can basically show where the houses are being demolished and therefore where people are becoming displaced. And then we're also starting to look at the use of big data, accessing major sources of news, and using, not to get too technical, I can get very nerdy when I start talking about that, but using natural language processing and machine learning to and social media analysis. Actually, we're also analyzing Twitter, Facebook, etc., to get a sense of how people are talking about displacement, how people are communicating about the conditions that they're living with, because that can also give you a sense of where people may be considering moving. So anyway, we're partnering with actually the UN on this iDetect. We've called it iDetect Challenge. You're welcome to actually check it out on our website. It's quite exciting. So I think there are a lot of promising technologies out there, but I'll leave it to
Actually, Kelly, I'm going to pause. I want to see if I can take one more remote question. We are really out of time on this. I'm looking up to see if I'm...
Sorry.
All right. How do panelists keep from being... This is a perfect final question for our panel. So, how do panelists keep from being personally overwhelmed by the heartbreak and frustration in their field? And I'm sure we all feel this, but a couple of comments. Anyone who wants to speak out on that? Maha, will you speak a few words on that?
Keep my eye on the ball, which is how do you, the empathy is important, recognizing personal loss of people you're working with is important, but keeping the eye on the ball, which is the long term. How do you find solutions for these people?
Karen?
Just to say, yeah, we are overwhelmed by heartbreak and frustration, but we also see a lot of small achievements. We see the things that we are able to do, the people you are able to help, and you just hope that there'll be more and more of those.
There's a lot of optimism also amongst people who have seen the worst, which is amazing.
Great. Okay, everyone, I'm afraid that our time is up. I think this is one of our small achievements. It's actually a huge achievement. The warmth of our host, the warmth of this audience, the intimacy of this venue has made for a really, really remarkable conference. So I want to thank all of you for making it so amazing, for all of you in Belfast, in Portland, in Rockland. Thank you. Thank you to this incredible panel.